Colloquium. This colloquium is an opportunity for students who have undertaken internship placement over the last couple of semesters to share some of their observations about their work, and for the rest of us to learn through them about their museum placements. Before we get started, for those of you who are new to the Museum Studies minor, and also students in the minor, just a few things about the program and some updates to our website. So the Museum Studies minor is a 6-course, 18-credit minor. And what we will be hearing from our students today is really about the work they've done for Museums 409, which is the practicum. And this is a unique feature of the minor in museum studies, that all of our students participate in museum practice of some sort. And as you'll hear today, this takes many different forms and is really unique to each of the institutions in which they are placed, and also each student, what they decide that they want to pursue for this particular course credit. The Museum Studies minor on our website, for those of you looking for courses for the winter, please check out the electives button. We will be updating this later today. You can see here there are downloadable PDFs so that you can see what courses have been pre-approved for the winter. We just finalized that yesterday, so we'll get that updated on our website later today. I also want to point out on our website that we have, this is a newer feature, hooray, we have an events calendar, and these are museum studies events here at the University of Michigan. And you can see there we are, the MSminor Colloquium. I also want to draw your attention to a virtual event that's occurring next Wednesday, which I will be moderating. This is a really interesting panel. We have someone from the Smithsonian and someone from the University of British Columbia's Museum of Anthropology coming to talk about visible storage and the way that sort of the history of these open storage concepts and what is happening today in their institutions. And so that's a really interesting sort of design, but also programming challenge for museums as we try to increase sort of access to our collections. Also here in recent news, these are student features, both current and also alum. And then over here, we have a new blog. It's launched this summer, and we've got actually Ben. He'll be sharing his internship work today, but he is one of our first blog posters. And here, if you link through there, you can read both graduate student blog posts, as well as some of our Museum Studies minor students. So please do check out the website. We are trying to do better with keeping it updated and getting content on there that will be useful for all of you. So today, right now, the way that we're going to format the colloquium, we'll have 5 students share lightning talk presentations about their internships. Some will share slides, observations, comments about the work they have done at a number of campus, but also on-campus off-campus museums. And then at the end, we are really lucky to have Allison Campbell joining us from the University of Michigan's Museum of Natural History. She is an alumna of the Museum Studies minor, and so we'll hear a little bit from her as well. And throughout the colloquium, we'll try to have a few moments here and there for questions. So if you have some, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we'll see if we can get a little bit of conversation here and there. All right, so without further ado, I will stop sharing and I'll invite Beatrix to talk about her work at the RMC.
Hello, my name is Beatrix Durgis. I'm a senior studying anthropology with minors in museum studies and theater design and production. And this past summer, I did my internship placement for Museums 409 at the Museum of Paleontology, which is housed in the university's Research Museum Center. As a research museum, the Museum of Paleontology doesn't have its own exhibition space. It does work with the Museum of Natural History, from what I gathered. And it has two main collections, the vertebrates and the invertebrates. And I was working under Adam Roundtree, the vertebrates collection manager, specifically on a project with the fish collection. So over the summer, it was me and then there were several grad students. And the project was to kind of go through the entire fish collection and increase the amount of information about each specimen and to eventually reorganize the entire collection. And so my part in that was going through each drawer and analyzing whether the current housing for each specimen was adequate, and then rehousing them if necessary. So some of them this would be they're in boxes with a cardboard box with a lid on it. We can't see what's inside of there. So they need to go in either a clear plastic box or a tray, things like that. But one major aspect of this that I was involved in was cradle making. So we had our basic trays for specimens that didn't need much extra support, but some of them had more complicated shapes and needed very individualized housing. And so that's what I did. I started out, I would measure the specimen, I would measure the space in the drawer, because there were a number of times when I got finished making the cradle and it was too tall for the drawer, and that was disappointing. So the outer box was made out of corrugated plastic, and we had looked into more archival ways to put the boxes together because we were using hot glue, but we couldn't find plastic rivets that would fit our needs. That was something I did research in early on in the summer. And then for making the rest, the structure of the cradle, used a foam blocks, and that was something I really enjoyed. For my theater background, I make a lot of props, and carving foam is one of my personal favorite ways to make props. And so it was fun to get to kind of bring that experience in to the museum setting. But so it was carving the foam so that the shape was right for the fossil, and then it got covered with a layer of batting and then a layer of Tyvek so that the specimen wouldn't catch on the supports. And then all of that was secured into the box with an archival adhesive. The other part of my work was doing some photogrammetry, which involves taking a lot of photos of specimen and then running them through a computer program to get a a digital 3D model of them. And that was really cool. We had this box with lights, and all of the inside was white so that the light would be even. And we had little Lazy Susan turntables for the specimens. So we put them on there, put them in the box, and then slowly spin them while we were taking photos. And we had to do that 3 different angles, and then flip the specimen over and take another at each of those 3 angles. so that the computer program could analyze them and figure out how the specimen fit together from the images. Yeah, those were the primary things I did at the museum.
Thank you, Beatrix. What a great way to start. Let's just move on, and maybe after Chloe's presentation, we can take a couple of questions for Beatrix and Chloe.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, so for my internship, let me introduce myself first, I guess. My name is Chloe, and I'm a senior at the University of Michigan. I major in evolutionary anthropology, and I have one minor in museum studies and one in history of medicine and health. And I chose to do my internship at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, and I worked in the collections management department. And I just wanted to start by saying that before I did this internship, I had no hands-on experience in any sort of museum setting. So a real goal for me was to see if I wanted to do collections management as a career, and if I wanted to work in museums sort of moving forward. And so that was my main goal going in. So for the things that I did this summer, there were 4 main things that I worked on. Firstly, I worked on inventorying a glass cabinet in the collection storage area, and I took a picture of it, which is on the left. This cabinet had a lot of different types of glass. It was primarily glass containers, so like vessels that hold things, but it also had some jewelry, which was initially what drew me to the cabinet, because it had some really colorful beads and jewelry, which I thought were super cool. And the Kelsey Museum, a lot of different museums do inventories in different ways, but at the Kelsey Museum, they do sort of a rolling inventory approach, where instead of just doing every cabinet like right in a row, they sort of do a cabinet here and there, and then over time they have a whole picture of the inventory of the whole entire area. So I just did one cabinet during my time. A second project I worked on was photography. So the picture on the right is actually a photo that I took. There was a researcher over the summer who was interested in some of the objects in the collection, but couldn't come physically to the museum. So we took photos of some objects and then sent them to her so that she could still do research. And this showed me, I guess, a lot of what really goes on in sort of a day-to-day of a collections manager, because it's not as simple as just you take a photo and then send it away. You have to do a lot of sort of like post-production work, where you have to change metadata of objects, you have to add copyrights, you have to edit the photos, you have to change them to different file types before you can send anything. So it really showed me a lot of what goes on behind the scenes. Additionally, with photography, I got to work on another project where there was a curator who was interested in having a lot of high quality photos of a lot of the objects in the collection, like hundreds of the objects. So basically, I worked as a photography assistant to help a professional photographer take higher quality photos of all the objects. I basically worked to help stage them, and that was something that I really enjoyed doing, because it's cool to see how photos of the objects are going to be used, whether for teaching or for curatorial projects or anything like that. So I thought that was super cool. Another project I work on was the archives. So there were 2 main things that I worked on this summer. First was sorting through photography slides. So the Kelsey Museum has 2 collections, or had 2 collections of slides. And slides are these little photographs. They're sometimes negatives and sometimes not. So on the left, that is one slide that I thought was really cool. It's just like a picture of the Kelsey Museum. But basically, they had 2 collections, one that was from the Kelsey, and then one was from the history of art department. So I worked on combining them into one collection because there were duplicates and missing things. So to see what we had of everything and just to combine them into one collection. And then my primary term project was thinking about how to make the photographs in the archive collection more accessible to the public. So I was thinking about ways that we could create search terms for different photographs. So for example, if there was a photo of a dog, for example, would you tag that, like put a tag on it as just dog, or would you tag that in the geographical location where the photo was taken or by the photographers, things like that. So thinking about how people could use search terms in order to make the collection more accessible. And then also in the archives, I helped out if there were any researchers. So there was a researcher who was interested in Karanis over the summer. And so I helped him view maps and archival documents that were in the archives. And then the last thing that I sort of worked on and off all summer was putting away and pulling different objects for either class use or researcher use. So this was just basically if a class needed a list of objects to teach with for a field trip, then I would pull them and get them ready or put them away. And then if a researcher needed something, I would do the same thing. And then this blue glass object next to it, that was actually something that was in the glass inventory that the glass cabinet that I inventoried. And it was something that I saw a lot throughout the cabinet with the objects, was that this object was probably originally just one color, but due to deterioration, it became sort of like iridescent and glowy and glittery kind of. So it was something I just thought was like super cool because the initial like object did not look like that, but now it looks a lot different and a lot it has a totally different way that it is. So I just thought that was something that was super cool with a lot of the objects that I found in the glass cabinet. And then lastly, just a few things that I learned overall this summer. So like I said, my goal going in was to find out if I was interested in becoming a collections manager. And I think that I am interested in that. I had a lot of fun this summer and I think it was really fun. Secondly, that a lot goes on behind the scenes with exhibits. So it's not as simple as just a curator picking an object. There's a lot going into how do the objects need to be stored? How do they need to be cared for? Things like that. Next, accessibility is a big problem with museum collections. Primarily, I'm thinking about the archives. So there's like hundreds and thousands of photos in the Kelsey archives that are not scanned in because it takes a lot of resources to scan in photographs. So there's like a large amount of photos that people might not even know exist. So that's why the search term project was very important. And then next, that the Kelsey has a lot of cool things that researchers are interested in. A lot of researchers came to the Kelsey specifically because the Kelsey was the only collection that had the things that they were interested in doing research in. And then lastly, that there are many specific procedures that go into caring for the collection, and each museum has different priorities and necessities. So each museum is going to be different based on the different needs that they have and the things that they prioritize. And that's it. I had a really great time at my internship, and it was a great experience.
Thank you so much, Chloe. We get a really nice sense of the many different things that you were doing through your internship. And between you and Beatrix, we get, already this very colorful sort of image of what a museum internship can look like. Before we move on to Natasha, are there any questions that anyone has for either of our first two speakers? It's okay if there aren't. You can save them up and we can ask them later. But feel free to add things into the chat as well, and we'll try to grab them as we move along. Great, thank you very much, Beatrix and Chloe. Natasha, are you ready to share with us?
Yes. Go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I internshiped at the Ella Sharp Museum of Art and History in Jackson, Michigan. It's primarily a local history museum for Jackson County. And it consists of like several different buildings, this like main museum building, and then like several historical outbuildings. The log cabin and the like single room schoolhouse were both brought onto the campus in the 1960s. And this is the original farmhouse, like from the Sharp family that donated their property to the people. I interned in the curatorial affairs department, and I spent a lot of time photographing and cataloging things and wandering around in the vaults and rehousing things. I was able to participate on several different projects throughout the summer. The first bigger one I was doing was cataloging this like massive donation of architectural blueprints. I moved all of these in here from our quarantine room into this new room that they're going into, and I alphabetized them, and I started writing the finding guide for them as I was shelving them. And the finding guide is just a document of like different individual objects. And for these objects, it was like the file name and place, year, number, and location, like in the museum itself, down to where they're at on the shelf. And that was really helpful to write a finding guide, because I ended up using those like pre-existing finding guides a lot later on in my internship to rehouse things, like finding a folder in a box on a shelf in a massive room to put a war ration book into. It's just knowing how those are written was really great to end up using that program later. I also participated in a mini exhibit at the Jackson Interfaith Shelter. The shelter had given us like a ton of primary source material that they had collected over the years. Newspapers and objects and name tags and awards that they had received, the original logbook from when the first shelter opened in 1975, and dozens of newspapers, which we read through and gathered information about like the spirit of the founder and just the history of the institution. And we used that information to write a label. And I was able to use the shelter's style guide to design this label, which was like a really interesting way that like my art background fit into the collections department of the museum. And I got to make this like really beautiful label. And I worked with a lot of their photos, and I scrubbed a lot of their photos of the dust, like using a dedusting feature, but also going in by hand and taking out big chunks so that the photo wasn't completely obscured, so that they're nice and crisp, because they intended to blow up a lot of these to be massive, from like 4x6 inch photos to like huge poster size for this, the background of the case of the exhibit. Probably my central job over my internship was working with objects from the history gallery. The gallery of this museum had been in place untouched for over a decade. And so there was a lot of objects that hadn't been properly documented or cataloged. And so like as we're taking everything down for it to be remodeled, my job was to photograph, catalog, and rehouse them. And I ended up going through over 100 objects during my time there. I just wanted to share a few of my favorite photos from like a collection of like a mid-century doctor's bag and Native American rugs. I think I added more photos than I probably was supposed to, because I really enjoyed taking really beautiful photos of details of things like the texture of this hand woven rug, and like with this wedding garment, this wedding dress, seeing the wear and tear on the hooks and loops in the back was just such an interesting thing that I thought was worthy of putting in the record. And Jackson was a really big manufacturing town around at the same time that Detroit was. And so like this little safe that was built there, having the cogs exposed, it just seems like a really interesting visual of how important manufacturing and making things like was to this community. And I just wanted to include that. And same thing with like taking photos of like typewriters and just getting rather artsy shots just because it's just so beautiful. And a lot of the objects are really, really special. One of my favorites was this Civil War photo album. That was huge and just like completely encrusted and gilded with gold and these mother of pearl gems on it and steel rivets. And then moving into something I wasn't expecting to encounter at the museum was modern history. The first probably being toys that I've played with, like Guitar Hero guitars sitting on the shelf of the museum was kind of a weird moment. But also during 2020, Jackson went through a sort of rebranding, taking this image of Andrew Jackson on the horse, which I think we're all familiar with, kind of the tearing down of racist statues. That's been happening in the past couple of years. And so Andrew Jackson owned enslaved people and generally has nothing to do with the city of Jackson other than being its namesake. And so they redesigned the city seal to have the skyline and the water because there's a major river that runs through. And so we got this like massive 3-foot diameter seal in the collection now. And at the same time, there was Black Lives Matter protests going on in Jackson. And my mentor was there collecting signs and stories from people in the protests. And one of the most significant posters that I photographed is this one, which I took into Photoshop and messed with the levels so that you can see the tire tracks that are visible in person, but because the board is neon, it's really hard to see in a photograph. But during the protests, a car drove by, turned around, and then drove directly into the protesters, hitting at least one person. And it just seems like a really, really significant object to have made its way into the museum and that we have, and really just kind of, for me, drove home how important these institutions are for collecting and sharing stories of the places that they service. Yeah, that was my internship.
Thank you, Natasha. There's a lot there to think about, and the range of projects that you worked on. And also, one thing that really is lovely in the presentation that you shared is how your own work as in art and design was able to support some of the work of the museum. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really wild how interdisciplinary museum is.
Yes, that is true. Thank you. Benjamin, shall we hear from you?
Yes. Share my screen. Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Ben Davis. I am a double major in anthropology and linguistics, and I also have 2 minors. One, obviously, in museum studies, the other in digital studies. And like Chloe, I also did an internship at the Kelsey Museum in the collections management department under Sebastian and Sina. Though funnily, we never really worked together because I worked mornings and she worked afternoons. So I think we're gonna actually only cross paths like once or twice in the museum, which I think was really, really funny. So in terms of kind of what I did, I kind of like laid it out in a list. So 1, inventorying. 2, did basically data collection and recording in our databases, deinstalled the exhibit, returned class objects to their permanent homes, photography, and worked with a lot of researchers. So this photo actually over here is we were deinstalling the 2nd floor exhibit of the Kelsey because there was construction going on. And so we had to actually get the glass open, take every object that was in the cases, put them all the way back down to our storage for safekeeping while construction was happening. And I remember specifically having to climb into the actual exhibition case with the exhibit designer and this object back here on the wall, having to remove the hooks and then like carefully, like while I'm in the actual like case, lean it down so it didn't fall. Never in my life did I think I was gonna be able to say I climbed into an exhibit case in a museum. And I think it's a memory that I will never ever forget. So specifically for inventorying, my lord, accession numbers, removal slips everywhere, so many numbers. Sometimes I felt like my eyes glazed over because there was just like so many numbers in front of my eyes. But the cabinet that I inventoried was the metal cabinets. I believe there was about over 2,000 objects, so pretty big. I spent a lot of time going through. I remember when I would get to a drawer like this that would have a bunch of tinier objects, I'd be like, no, because I knew that it would take so much of my time. But then when I saw bigger objects, I'd be like, yes. I remember specifically one of the objects that I actually found while going through there was like a pan that I think was used for cooking, which was really interesting. And I kind of had this surreal moment of finding an object that was thousands of years old, but was almost identical to one that like I used that morning to like cook my eggs for breakfast. Another thing, I returned a lot of objects because internship started around May, so a lot of classes were ending, and so a lot of the classes that used objects from the Kelsey in the winter semester had to be put away. And then at the end of my internship, given that it was August, I started taking objects out for classes in the fall. Unlike Chloe, though, I didn't really do much work in the archive itself. The most that I did was, we'll talk about this later, I had to go through a lot of the folders that the Kelsey has in the archives related to exhibitions. For researchers in photography, I interacted with tons of scholars, graduate students, photographers at my time in the Kelsey. For instance, there was, like Chloe mentioned, the photographing tons of the Roman Egypt collection, tons of Ushapti, which are an Egyptian artifact, which I believe I have time in to get into what Ushapti actually are. And there was also a researcher from Europe who came in to research almost the entirety of the Kelsey Museum's wood collection. So he was there for several weeks going through all of our wood. He had instruments basically like studying. I don't know exactly what his like purview was, but he was here for a while. And then down actually at the bottom are photographs that I actually took before doing this internship. I had experience kind of doing portrait photography, but nothing really concrete in terms of object photography. And I ended up really, really loving it. I remember every time we would be taking out objects for researchers, I would kind of ask Sebastian and be like, are there photos of this in the database? And if not, can I photograph, please? I want to do this. I want to click the camera. I found it to be so engaging and so fun. And honestly, it kind of spurred an interest in photography that I'm still engaging with today. A lot of my work, though, was in the database. So for one, data collection in terms of going through, making sure that while I'm going through the metals cabinet, that everything is there that should be there, creating records if they need to be created. Luckily, I did not have the power to delete records. Wouldn't want that power. No, thank you. But so two of my main projects that I did in my time with the Kelsey were with the database. One was cataloging exhibitions and kind of linking records. So in our database, we had records of exhibitions that happened within the museum, and then we also had objects. And what Sebastian kind of tasked me with doing is making sure that objects that within their records said they were part of certain exhibition were linked with the exhibition record, because some were, but a lot of them were in fill in the blank like text boxes. So they actually weren't actually put into the record hierarchy or actually linked in any way. So I would go through for a couple hours each time I was there and scroll through the database, look and see when I found an object that had something in the text box that wasn't linked, and then link it to the exhibition. And if the exhibition wasn't having a record at all, I would actually create that record. And then there was some times where there was really obscure, esoteric, like kind of acronyms that nobody knew. There was EANE or like other stuff like that where you'd only know what that means if you were actually there during the time. So sometimes Sebastian would know the answer. Other times I would have to go into the actual archives and be, okay, what is this record's acronym that's in here? What could it possibly be? And kind of do some detective work. And then my final term project was I made a language and script hierarchy in our database. So when I came into the Kelsey, the way in which the database stored information about language and script was a fill in the blank. So if there was something Latin, you would just say Latin. Or potentially someone could say vulgar Latin or classical Latin. What that ends up is that you could look up Latin, but you could be getting all of these things that might be related to it, might not be related to it, and you can't really easily specify things. So what I had to do is I kind of brainstormed what is the best way in which we can basically create a hierarchy for language and for script that would make it much easier to search through. So for instance, I had to think about for here with Sumerian, language isolate, no big deal, cool, create a thing for Sumerian. But like Akkadian, I'd have to think about, okay, what's the best way for the objects to kind of be put in here? Should we do Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian all as separate things? Or should we do kind of where you click Akkadian and then you can get more specific and then say Assyrian, and then you can get more specific than that and say like Old Assyrian. And also I had to think about how specific is too specific. The same thing with script. Many different ancient languages use cuneiform. How do I encapsulate that? How do I encapsulate the differences with that? So it was kind of a brainstorming of here's language and script data. How do we make it more accessible and easily searchable? And I kind of wanted to just end with kind of like my expectations and surprises. From like coursework in 301 and 401, I knew that collections management was so central to museums. I didn't realize how central it was. At my time at the Kelsey, I was interacting with the exhibition designers, curators, conservators, and more. Everybody seemed like they had to come back to collections management before they could even do anything. And to be honest, going into this internship, I thought that my main interest in museum work was going to be curatorial stuff. I came in thinking that like that sort of knowledge production and like exhibition like creation was going to be where I vibed with. Turns out I was wrong. I think that collections management is honestly where I fit a lot more, and kind of the issues that we were talking about with accessibility and preservation is really where my interests really truly do lie. Second, I realize that people skills are very, very important. Hope you like to talk because you're gonna have to meet a lot of people and you're gonna have to learn how to juggle balancing researchers and curators and other people in your department. So it's really a people-focused job, despite it being something about the collections. The people still are important. And then finally, community. I was a student in the Kelsey, but I also felt like just one of the workers. I collaborated so much with other people in other departments and with the two collections managers at the Kelsey. I felt really at home in the museum. I felt really welcomed by all of the staff, and it really just made my experience of working in a museum that much more, and it grew my love for museum work generally. I believe that's all I have.
Thank you, Ben. And actually, I think Sebastian is on here. So thank you, Sebastian, for mentoring Ben and Chloe in these really fantastic internship experiences. Much appreciated. And we'll move on now to a different collection altogether, and we'll hear from Fiona and her work at the Clark Library.
Hi, everyone. I'll make this brief just so we have time to get to Allison and hear about her stuff. I gotta share my screen. Okay, so hi, everyone. Like Professor Henneberry said, my name is Fiona Kahi. This past summer, and kind of before and now actually, I've been working at the Stephen S. Clark Map Library, which is on the second floor of Hatcher. You've probably seen it. Oops. So just a little bit about me and kind of how I found myself in this position. I study Romance languages and literatures, and yes, it's not just a department, it's also a major. So I focus on French and Italian languages. I'm also in the residential college, so if you know anything about that, you can probably deduce that I am a language nerd and whatnot. I also study history and obviously museum studies. And I'm a senior, so throughout my 3 years at the university, I've kind of been doing research in art history, which wasn't really expected, on kind of just general roles of images. I've done research on the role of images in 19th century art. I've done some translation work, kind of also revolving around images, and that led me to the role of maps and the role of text and image within a map. And with that, I started just the reference desk position at the Clark Library in the winter of 2022. But through the summer, I kind of joined more in a research capacity at the library. I use my French skills quite a bit because the library is known to have a very robust collection of Parisian plans and French more broadly. So I was really able to use my French language skills and kind of just deducing what do we have? We have such a large collection, but comparing what we have to other institutions, not only in America, but also at the BNF, for example, in Paris. And like I said, since I studied French, I was a pretty big asset to my mentor because I was able to read more about what the maps actually showed and looking at bibliographies of other maps, you know, that's only in the French language. But in general, I had a lot of flexibility in what I could do. So not only did I sit, like I just said, kind of deducing what we do have in the collection and comparing it to others, I was also able to help my mentor kind of choose other pieces that we should acquire. And if I've learned anything from 301 and 401, it's that money matters. My mentor was always, you know, trying to apply for different grants and whatnot, going to dinners with donors, you know. So it really does matter in trying to acquire new pieces and whatnot. I also had the opportunity to engage with visitors this summer too. So this one picture here that shows the lecture room was just some person coming in from Czechoslovakia for the weekend and wanted to see any maps. We had a Bohemia, and of course we had a 40-sheet map, you know, of 18th century Bohemia, so we brought that out. So the flexibility and using my skills in the internship was really gratifying. I've also kind of learned from after having worked at the Clark for some time now that there's maps more than just in the Clark Library. I kind of call this the dynamic trio. I worked a lot with people at the Clements. The Clements is known for American history, but they also have a map division. So some maps that we wouldn't have, you could find in the Clements, and those are usually older maps from 15th, 16th century. Then in Hatcher itself, of course, the Clark. We all know the stacks. You can find a lot of bibliographies on maps there. And then also special collections, which is a few floors up. They carry some maps that we don't have. And then lastly, Buer. That's the shelving facility down kind of near like the athletic campus. And that was awesome because I was able to observe a map being conserved. It wasn't a French map. It was actually the map of Thomas Jefferson's father. But my mentor wanted to come back to the Clark after being conserved. So I got to go down there and see that. I've also kind of learned that between Hatcher, the Clark at least, and Buer, there's kind of a tug of war sometimes for who gets to keep what, you know. They carry a lot of oversized items that, at least from my mentors, conversations with them, kind of wants to bring them back to the Clark, you know, because we are a map library. But in general, it's very, if you want a map on campus, all three of these resources are great to consult. And what now? So I still work at the Clark right now. I was actually there last night. This picture I took last night to make the presentation. I do mostly reference desk work, so I help students, you know, find maps and whatnot. I still do some research, but I'm planning to do more next semester because I have a less busy schedule. And I've just really enjoyed this experience. I've always loved maps, images, foreign languages, and it kind of just really catered to all of my academic and personal interests at the university. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Fiona. It's I definitely want to dig into some of those maps that you just shared. That's absolutely wonderful. What amazing objects, and to be surrounded by them all the time. Lucky you. And yes, let's move now. Just our last presentation is a guest, Allison Campbell. I am really grateful that she agreed to join us. She is an alumna of the Museum Studies minor program, and she'll say a bit about that experience and what she's doing now. So welcome, Allison.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Deirdre, for having me and thinking of me. So I guess just to be cognizant of time, I'll try to give a very brief to how I got here now. And here is actually, I'm in the museum storage vault. So you'll see all this kind of cool taxidermy behind me. That's from the Ruthven Museum and did not make it into our newer exhibits, but could possibly make it into other exhibits in the future. So I did the museum studies minor when I was an undergrad. My internship experience was at Stamps Gallery, and it was actually sort of more of a curatorial internship. My background is more in art and design. But here you see me, I am sitting in a science museum. So just to share my screen, let me go over this so you have some images to look at while I am talking. Can everyone see that? Awesome. So I graduated. I was working at Stamps Gallery. They hired me on after I was a student intern there. So I was working there for a bit, and then doing a little bit of like freelance design work for some other firms. And that kind of like very happenstancedly got me into this job at the Natural History Museum. So it was a new position. So my position did not exist in the old Ruthven Museum. So a little bit about the museum. The natural history collections were founded in 1837. As Beatrix touched on earlier, this exhibit, or this museum, used to be called the Exhibit Museum because we were only intended to exhibit. We were not necessarily a collecting institution. But over the years, we have accumulated a collection, pretty small collection compared to all of the other institutions on campus, which is why we don't officially have a full-time collections manager. So that responsibility is split between myself and then the head of exhibits. So in 2019, we moved into the new building, and that is just about when I started here. So that gets us to now. I do work in the exhibits department. It's kind of we are a big museum, right? But we're such a small staff. I think it surprises a lot of people. We have about like 15 full-time staff. The exhibit department has 3 full-time staff. We've got the head of exhibits, we've got our preparator, and then myself. So it's a really small team for a really big building. So we are totally busy, but we do a lot of work with the research museums and other units on campus. And then I just kind of did a little, some images of projects that I've been able to work on throughout my past 3 years here, just so you can kind of get an idea of the work. And really, I just want to, I guess, stress throughout how much like all museum work is very interdisciplinary, right? Like I have this art background, but now most of the work I do is science, but right, in a way, science is art and art is science. It's all kind of like working together. So yeah, so this first slide is 2 of our collection case exhibits. These were like some of the first projects I worked on in the new museum space. They were of Anishinaabe baskets. So we got to work with the Zeebwing Center of Culture and Lifeways out of Mount Pleasant. We also worked with the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology, and then a faculty member and her students in anthropology, Lisa Young. So the case on the right of my screen was a student project. So we worked with a bunch of students to showcase their research. And then on the left was working with the Zeebwing Center to showcase these baskets, and basket making as a contemporary practice, right? So that was one or two big exhibit projects. Another project that I've worked on was our virtual whale exhibit that we worked on with a company called Saganworks. So I was able to work with folks from the Museum of Paleontology. Adam Roundtree was on this project. He's great. He's wonderful. So he sent us the whale models, and then we did the design and the text and the layout, and ended up creating this sort of collaborative, immersive experience. And this was sort of our way to reach out to people, showcase some of the information that was cut from the old museum when we opened the new museum evolution gallery, and reach people in their homes, right? Because this was during COVID. So this was quite a big COVID project. And we have, right, permanent exhibits in this new building, many of which were designed by a very big design firm, that when there was the new museum project and we had all of this money for a big new building, but believe it or not, those sort of permanent exhibits are not perfect the first time around. So the exhibits team and myself got to kind of come back in. You'll see this image on the left. So I guess I would encourage everyone to think of like exhibits, at least not as these like permanent, one time you do it, it's done, that's the one truth things, but as these sort of like living, working things that will change and shift even over the course of a few years. So on the left, there was this sort of flat table-like surface. It wasn't elevated. It was totally inaccessible for readability. Most of us who are in the department now were not there when this was conceived, so we were not able to sort of stop these problems before they happened. But we ended up repainting, we got the rail replaced, changed a lot of the content, updated it to more recent research, got some new specimens out, and then the image on the bottom right with that red background is the new redone corner. So that was quite a big project that I felt very lucky to, I think, as Ben mentioned, climb into the cases and touch dinosaurs is a lot of fun. We did another big show in our experimental gallery this past winter, facing the pandemic. I had the opportunity to interview these 10 individuals about their experience during COVID. We paired that with research that the university had done about health disparities during the COVID pandemic. And then put it all into an exhibit. So that this is currently on our lower level gallery. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I felt very lucky. I feel very lucky in my job early in my career to be able to kind of work on these big projects. And so just to tell all of you that you can also work on big projects and don't feel like super scared and overwhelming. One day you'll just wake up and be like, okay, I think I can do this now. But it'll be scary at first. Then again, these are our last most recent iteration of the collections and student showcases. The one on the left is with Matt Friedman and the Museum of Paleontology about ancient fish fossils. So that was kind of a challenge to make most of these fossils look like just rocks and to try to make them visually interesting. So we set them on these sort of cutout silhouettes and, came up with an aesthetic that we thought would tell a story. And then on the right side, it showcases student research done in different classes at the Biological Station. So that's what's on display now. And I know I'm running low on time, but a sneak peek at an upcoming exhibit that we are working on now is with a researcher from Physics. He does dark matter research in a gold mine, it's an underground research facility in a gold mine in South Dakota. I got the chance to visit the gold mine. It was amazing. It was wonderful. If you're ever in Lead, South Dakota, go to the Sanford Underground Research Facility. But right now we are putting together sort of the storyline, and there's a bunch of art that an artist in residence in the gold mine created. So that'll be all go into the show. So that is in the works and will be installed in March in our lower level experimental gallery. Yeah. And feel free to send me an email or add me on LinkedIn. Let me know if you have any questions, or if you're interested or just want a tour of the museum, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Allison. And I will vouch for the fact that Allison gives a really excellent tour. I was there last winter with a class of graduate students, and we got to see and hear from her about a lot of the work that they have done to make the museum so fantastic. So thank you very much. And actually, thank you to all of you for joining us, and of course to our presenters for sharing their work and their observations about these internship experiences. It's a really special facet of the museum studies minor, and it's always a joy to kind of hear in your own voices about this work that you have been doing. So thank you all. Thank you again, Allison, for joining us as our special guest. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Friday, and that I see you soon. So take care. Thank you.